Hello, welcome, and thank you all for joining this month's Humanity at the Heart, book club chat. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. We won't have time to go around and do an audio introduction with everybody. And if you want to include your contact details for each other, that would be great. We're also recording this session, and with minimal editing, we'll post it on our YouTube channel, and we'll let you know when we've done that. I'm Brendan Martin. I'm founder and MD of the social enterprise Public World. We work internationally to support change based on enabling and supporting public service professionals to operate with the greater freedom and responsibility needed for relational services. In 2015, we began a partnership with Buurtzorg of the Netherlands, which led to test and learn projects in around 40 different settings in health, social care, and housing. And that work produced a rich and growing body of knowledge, which we're capturing in our learning and development programs, which we call Humanity at the Heart. That's also the name of our online community, which has a section enabling any member, around 400 at the moment, to flag up a book they think has importance. So we thought, let's have a series of online events with an author, and this is the fourth of those. And I'm especially excited about this month's club because Cormac Russell and his work have been an increasing influence on our own in recent years. And I'm glad to say, in fact, that we're now collaborating actively, along with our friend Katie Kelly, in developing and offering to public service organisations an approach we call asset-based workforce development, which draws on and synergises our respective bodies of experience and knowledge. So a very warm welcome to you, Cormac. Thank you for making the time to join us today. And we decided, as you know, to focus on your 2020 book, Rekindling Government. My well-thumbed and annotated copy is here. Although since then, Cormac's also published another with his late friend and asset-based community development collaborator, John McKnight, the Connected Community, and he's currently indeed working on his next book. So no doubt we'll draw on all three today. And in any case, our purpose is not to be tied to any one book in this conversation, but to let the talking go where it will. And we rely on you and your inputs for that. But we'll start with Rekindling Government. And I always start these sessions by asking the author to tell us what the book's about, why he or she wrote it. And today I'm going to tweak that a bit by also asking about the title. I can think of a few books starting with words such as reimagining this or reinventing that. So, Cormac, why rekindling in particular?
Well, it's a great question actually, and great to be together with all of you as well. I think rekindling is a really playful word, and it's much more interesting to me than words like reform or even reimagine, as you say, because I think the idea of rekindling is such a modest one. So kindling, as everybody will know, is what we use to get a fire started. So most people can lay their hands on kindling if you know where to look and if you take enough time. And it's always imperfect kindling. You know, there's never a shop brand called kindling. So it's something that's homemade, it's homespun. You find it locally. You've got to be prepared to be a bit curious, but it's findable. And I like that idea because if you breathe, you can do that. If you breathe, you're in. So this idea that rekindling democracy is everybody's business, and you don't have to be, you know, credentialed in any particular way to be part of that. So I like that idea. And I think in that word as well, some nice, neat, smaller words like kind and Kinder, which is German for child. So I like the idea that across the life course, that age is not a barrier and may in fact, in a lot of ways, be a real blessing, you know, across the latter ends of it. So that was the broad brush of it. Myself and John, when the book was in manuscript form, and the publisher at this stage was kind of saying, "Well, look, we really need to put the final dots on the you know, dot the i's and cross the t's." We were still without a title when I said to John, "I'm thinking of calling it Rekindle Rekindling Democracy, he came up with the rest of it. So I said Rekindling Democracy, and he said, yes, a professional's guide to working in citizen space. That was and the follow-on sentence is, you and I should write a book together. And so we did. So that's a little bit of history as well as ethnography.
Well, as you say, thanks for that. And as you say, the subtitle is A Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space. And I'm just going to kick the conversation off with firstly, I want to say what a rich book this is. It's in many ways, I found it several books in one because it approaches its common themes from through a number of different lenses, and there'll be stuff in there that's of interest to not only people working on community development or in public services, but also international development and local economic development. A lot of different lenses you approach it from, but a story in it that's quite early in the book that's always stuck with me in my memory um, since I first wrote it, and I dip into the book quite often, is a fascinating one, I think, and it concerns um, a community in which some households derive their income from salmon fishing in a river running through their place and sought and secured the help of their municipal leaders when others kept cutting the nets they used to trap the fish so that poachers further upstream could catch them instead. And when I read this, I thought to myself, well, one community's fishers are another community's poachers. So doesn't this story show the necessity for representative government to mediate between competing interests? And doesn't that legitimize institutional authority on matters affecting more than one community or geography? In which case, is it how authority is distributed and the boundaries between different sources of legitimacy and how those bodies of legitimate authority understand their roles and boundaries and relate to each other? Is that what we need to focus on?
I think so. And it's interesting is some people, when they talk about asset-based community development, and I suspect, 30 years ago, I was guilty of this too, um, would have characterized institutions and communities in some way as though they were competing for power with each other. And that can often, and sadly too often, be the case, but it doesn't necessarily get us very far in terms of answering your question. So your question is one of alignment, I think. So, a way of thinking about the whole conversation in rekindling democracy is that it's not pitting community and institutions against each other, but it's asking how they can be aligned best with each other and in a way that doesn't bestow a monopoly on institutions, which is largely, I think, where we've ended up, because that can either create antagonism, which actually almost creates a counter push from communities against institutions, or it can create I suppose, an expectation that institutions will do our living, our dying, our, justice for us, and that we're just ancillary spectators. So it's a question about how do we use these institutions, or how can these institutions be useful and in service in a democracy to to citizens. And I think that story, just for people, just a little bit of context. So the story goes, as you say, a group of people who are relying on the salmon realize the nets have been cut, which gives them an opportunity to harvest a certain amount of salmon in their part of the stream. This is on the Canadian. It is interesting, actually, given what's happening geopolitically at the moment. This is on the French-speaking Canadian side, or the Atlantic side of Canada, I should say, and it's in a little village called Amqui. And so the story goes that the three citizens who spot what's happening, immediately approach the mayor. It's a very, very small little community, about 2,000 people, and the mayor has been a mayor forever. And the three individuals come along and they're frustrated, so they start, in French, asking the mayor what he's going to do. So he's, if you like, the representative of government, but it's a really interesting story because of the scale. As well as being a governmental representative, he's also a neighbor. He's lived there all his life, right? He's part of the village. This is a really interesting kind of blurring of the lines. You see this a little bit in things like Buurtzorg and things like that. You know, when the professional lives and also works in the community, and it's a scale of neighborhood, not the scale of city or the scale of country, all kinds of things become possible uh, in ways that aren't possible in a conversation about Greenland, for example, just to be topical. So these guys come along and they say, you know, what are you going to do about it, Mayor? And the mayor immediately does what I think is a really good expression of alignment. The mayor doesn't take the bait. The mayor refuses to be drawn into taking the authority away from community and saying, leave that with me, I'll sort that out. And what he says instead is, yeah, you're right, that is a problem. We need to figure out how to address it. Do you know anybody locally that you could invite to be part of the conversation? Let's get them in on it. I'll see you at 7:30 in my office, which is in the neighborhood. You go into a lot of these rural areas and see this in Australia too, and in many European countries. Pretty much, it's a converted building or a room upstairs over a store or whatever. So there's nothing terribly formal about where the mayor is located. They all come along, three, four other people join the first three, and they sit down and they have a conversation about what needs to be sorted. And that's where the mayor can begin to say, well, how do we sort this in a way that isn't going to alienate our neighbors, but also may draw them into common purpose with us? And near the end of the conversation, which largely is a conversation whereby I think the people present start acting into the question, living into the questions that they're asking. So the mayor says at the end of the conversation, what struck me about what we've just done over the last hour is each of you showed up in this conversation in a way that I would expect people who are members of a salmon preservation society behaving. And then he said to them, what is it I could do to be useful to you? You've kind of set out a plan and you've set out some things that we might do. And they didn't know. They didn't know what to suggest to him as mayor or as a member of government that he or they could do to be supportive to citizens. So he said to them, he decoded it and he said, well, I think one of the things that I could do is give you somewhere to meet. The other is every 6 weeks, I can formally make it so that you can come along to the council and actually let us know how things are coming along, but also hold us to account. So as you figure out what support needs to look like, you can do that. And maybe the third thing is I could challenge you a little bit because, there are some communities downstream of this community that are really badly affected by the way we behave, just in the way we're badly affected by the way some poachers are behaving. Might it be that we need to factor in inviting them into the conversation too? It's much easier, I think, for the people in the conversation to entertain those kinds of ideas and that generosity in a context like that. The other thing is that I think that mayor also has a function along with government to begin to deal with other external forces, like, for example, Monsanto, and I'm just using Monsanto as an example. If Monsanto or a similar kind of commercial outlet comes into a neighborhood and starts doing something that is affecting the livelihood and the well-being of people in the neighborhood, like patenting seeds that were actually indigenous to that local community, I would say it's a very strong argument for saying there's a role for government to use its regulatory functions and its public health functions to make it very difficult for Monsanto to function in that environment and to level up the playing field in favor of citizens and to make it very, very difficult for a bad actor to get away with it. So in that sense, it's not about big government, small government. That's the wrong argument. The better argument is at what point do we need our governments to be big and at what point do we need them to be small? So we don't want our governments to be big when they're following us into the bedroom, but we want them to be very big if we've got a bad actor that's going to do harm to our communities. So actually what you want is almost like a peacock effect of government, where it's proportionate in its response to community, always foregrounding the capabilities of the community and then creating a dome of protection. And if you read that story, I think that has it has the kernel, if you like, of those ideas in it. That's why it's so early on in the book. Well, I don't know if that
Very,
answers the
very good,
question.
very helpful indeed, Cormac. And loads I could come back on, but I'm going to be a bit disciplined. Of course, this is mainly for giving everybody here with us an opportunity to join in the conversation. Please do that with any observations you've got about what Cormac has said or what you've read in his book or any questions you might have for Cormac. Please go ahead. But in order for me to call on you with any of that, you'll need to have your camera on. And quite a few people have chosen not to have their camera on. I know there's often very good reasons for that. But if you can turn it on, we'd love to see you. So that would be very nice. But also, I won't be able to respond to your physical hand or your digital hand unless I can see one or the other of those. And are there any observations or questions anybody would like to ask at this stage? Please think about those people. I'd love to hear any of your questions. You can pop them into the chat if you like as well, or any observations or references you'd like to share with others. But better if you put your hand up physically, as I say, or digitally using the Zoom tool for that, so that I can bring you straight into the conversation directly. While I still we're on this topic. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, in actually a very different kind of context, the highly urban context in which I live, um, where a current uh, local controversy, as in many parts of London and probably in many other cities in Britain as well, is to do with what are called low traffic neighborhoods. And these are neighborhoods where the local authority is closing off some roads in order to engineer traffic flows through other roads or dissuade people from making those journeys at all, in the interests of hyper-local communities, some of which will then have a much greener and less polluted, very local environment. However, the displacement of traffic is also taking that traffic away to other parts of the community. In fact, in my borough, in particular, to parts of the community in which the poorer um, people in the community are likely to live on boundary roads, on busy roads, and so on. And again, this is displays, I think, a tension between what is in the interests of very local communities and what is needed to take into account when engaging with those communities about actual policy and practical solutions. Because not only the community, one of the things this policy is designed to thwart is using the streets in the borough as streets that others who don't live in the borough can use to get from some other place to a third place coming through. And of course, some people need to do that. Some people don't, no doubt, and should go by bike or by bus or whatever instead. But some people need to do that because of the nature of our integrated local economies and national economies. In other words, there is so much complexity um, in the context in which we're talking about community, asset-based community development. Um, and I wonder if you could say something about how to cut through that complexity in a way that gives a guide, as you say, a professional's guide, to how to work in citizen space.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the challenges is always with these things is that even though we're talking about these impacts happening at neighborhood level, they're largely felt often in isolation. So even if your neighbors are collectively annoyed about something that's happening and see the injustice of what's happening across a number of neighborhoods, so some neighborhoods are getting privileged, decision making because they're seen to vote more or because they're seen to have more muscle in terms of money or whatever it might be. I think invariably there's always going to be elements of injustice, particularly in economically marginalized communities. And so there's a principle, Saul Alinsky talked about the great American organizer. If you don't have money power, you better have people power. And actually, people power is not the right way to describe it because what you really want is associational power. So, when your money isn't made, or when your muscle isn't made of money, it's got to be made of organizing. And I think one of the things that's interesting is to flip that question and say, well, is there a third category of neighborhood, which is whether it's poor or rich, is well organized? And I think our work over the last 30 or more years has been about supporting communities to move from being individual dissatisfied or satisfied consumers of private or public goods into being collectivized and operating at some level in a neighborhood context at some level around what is our mutual interest here? What's our collective vision for our neighborhood? And can we have that conversation in a collaborative way with other neighborhoods? So there are cities around the world, and I'm thinking, for example, of Seattle, where what you're describing immediately would run into all kinds of political roadblocks that you don't hit if you're a professional or you're a citizen operating perhaps in a lot of boroughs in London, where you have a representative democracy, but you also have a centralized bureaucracy. And decision making is often made around health and education and traffic, very much to favor those that are economically, privileged. There are, and I'm not saying that Seattle is perfect, it's far from. But one of the things that's interesting about Seattle is it's organized around neighborhoods, not just individuals. And that's interesting because one of the things, if you want to make sure that neighborhoods have power, give them the power to plan, right? Which is to say, not give them in a kind of, paternalistic way, but in a genuine way, relocate the authority. So what's problematic in your story is that we come to that conversation when it's too bloody late. We're coming as complainers. The real power is in can we actually shape the not in any way that disadvantages other neighborhoods, but can we at neighborhood level, first of all, shape our ability to, with our neighbors, co-create and co-design and co-plan our neighborhoods, but also then to ask our professionals to figure out with us how we can have a conversation that's a neighborhood of neighborhoods conversation, because that's the way I think of cities. So it's interesting in Seattle, and I've seen it in other, a little bit there's a place, Bergen, in the north of Norway that does some of this as well, where they will have conversations with individuals and what you might call target groups. But also as a city, they will have neighborhoods come together. And each of the neighborhoods will actually have a conversation about what would the neighborhood perspective be on this. So I think it's a really interesting conversation. And some of what public servants have to do in that instance is to facilitate and enable the various folks who are naturally enough, they're going to represent their own perspective, their own neighborhood, but also to try to figure out, are there ways through collaboration that they can actually create a neighborhood of neighborhood city? Not always easy to do, but the principle of democracy is that the governed govern, and therefore our folks that are lucky enough to get a salary to help us along with that have to figure out how that actually works. And I think part of it is this idea of stewardship. So the more people have a sense that they're not just involved or consulted, but they're actually shaping and they're planning themselves, I think the more likely it is that ultimately, as messy as it may be, that we'll get to a space where people will be much, much happier with whatever. And this is always going to be a negotiation of surrender, as well as getting some of what we want for our neighborhood. By necessity, we're going to have to surrender certain things to other neighborhoods. So moving from that kind of competitive to that more collaborative and more cooperative piece is important too.
Thanks, Cormac. Um, Let me encourage everybody to think about any points you'd like to make again, or any questions. But now I'll bring in Rhonda Riaki, and please introduce yourself briefly, Rhonda. Very nice to see you, and over to you.
Thank you. Rhonda Riachi from Oxford Brookes University, actually wearing two hats at least today, because my main role at Brookes is as recruiting patients, service users and carers to come and talk to our students, but I'm also co-lead for the Healthy Aging and Care Research Network across the university, multidisciplinary researchers who are trying to look at a whole lot of social problems, some of which you've already mentioned. And one of the projects I'm involved in is basically trying to get a collaboration going to make Oxford an age-friendly city. It's one of those things that's been discussed for a number of years, but nobody's actually taken the initiative to sign the letter and send it off, etc., do the application. And we thought the way we would approach this as sort of three of us sort of researchers together would be to try to approach those groups who don't normally get involved in this kind of stuff. So not people who look like me, usually, not people like me who have been city councillors and all that kind of stuff, but community groups out there doing a lot of good stuff, which is often under the radar. So I guess I'm really just sort of looking for any pointers, what you would suggest. I have a few ideas, and based on the kind of recruitment I've already been doing to attract sort of a more diverse group of service users, but also thinking about what you would suggest. And bearing in mind, we've just got a little bit of pump priming to do this over about 7 months, etc., and to get this collaboration going. And we'll have a couple of events. But anything you'd like to say on that? Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Well, I think the first thing is just to say I think what you're doing is great because you're starting where virtue is already afoot. So often when we talk about community building, I think we're talking about building community from the center out. But actually, I think there's a lot of virtue in building community from the edges in. So really beginning to think about who are the strangers, who are the people who are, as you say, doing it already, but maybe not always invited to the formal table because they're busy at their own kitchen table. So I think what you're describing is a really important reframe. And I would love if we did it more often, actually, which is to say, rather than bring what we think is a solution to what we think is the problem, to start with appreciating that we're guests in the lives of people, in this case in Oxford, who have been aging for millennia. And somehow, in all their, modestness, they managed to figure it out. So I think the reason that they managed to figure it out is because they didn't act like service users. So this is the second reframe I'd suggest is that the question you're asking is a question of nature, not a question of consumerism in that sense. Or, while I understand, the virtues of services, I think aging, when we think about it, is about so much more than anything that can be provided as a service. So one of my thoughts for what it would be that outside of programs and services and whatnot, we live our lives in the round very much on the basis of you know being friends with people, connecting with neighbors, muddling along, and in all kinds of ways. When we take this bucket called services and set it to one side, and we actually talk about just what it's like to grow old, or what it's like to age, or what it's like to die, or what it's like to lose a lover or a partner, or whatever it might be. I think everybody has something to say. And we just recently had the joy of working with Healthcare Excellence Canada across 26 different communities in Canada. And again, I'll talk about other countries in a moment, but similar to what we learned in Singapore, in an Asian context, is wherever you go culturally, people are aging and they have wisdom to share. But that wisdom gets shut down because the people who are often asking in a code that says, if you don't look a certain way, you don't speak a certain way, you don't actually meet my categories, I'm really not interested. So unless you can give me the answer in a way that actually meets funding criteria, sounds quite servicey, uses language that nobody really in the real world ever uses, then I'm not really interested. And so most people disqualify themselves from the conversation. Now, there's the third and final thing I'd say is therefore, one of the ways we can trick ourselves into being useful in conversations like that is to think of ourselves as guests rather than the hosts. So often we think about, we need to think about aging well in Oxford. And we've got this great privilege, if you like, in our various roles, maybe university or whatever it might be. Let's use that and put it at the disposal of people. And then we invite them to come to the university, and that can have its place. But I think a much more interesting and much more playful question would be, is there a way that you might behave whereby they would be inclined to say, wouldn't it be amazing to have Rhonda come join us at our kitchen table for a conversation? So that would be a question that's about being the guest, not the host. I think that if you arrived early to that party, stayed late, and joined the folks that are having cigarettes out the back. I'm not promoting cigarette smoking, but it'd be very interesting conversations around the edges. I think you'd find out everything you need to know about aging well in Oxford, but it will never, ever appear in a formal consultation.
Very, very interesting. Thanks, Cormac. I'm glad to see we've got participants today from all corners of the world, even from Perth, Australia, and from Canada and the United States. So welcome all your questions or put comments wherever you're from. I also have been just keeping a little bit of track of some of the observations in the chat. I recommend them to you. And in fact, I wonder if I might put you on the spot, Jane Gallagher, because of the comment you've added to the chat about the work that you've been doing, I think, in Birmingham. Am I right? It's Birmingham?
Oxford.
Oh, you're also in Oxford. Oh, right. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that because what you popped in the chat is very interesting. Could you say a bit about the work you're doing in Oxford?
I work for Community First Oxfordshire, and I've worked in community development for quite a few years. And when I was younger, always found it hard. And then I moved to an area about 25 years ago, that was in Oxford, called Florence Park. And I'm from Glasgow, and in Glasgow, people talk to each other at bus stops. We say hello on the street. It's cultural things. Some places do, some places don't. In Oxford, even in East Oxford, people do that less so, I found. And my family were embarrassed if I talked to people at bus stops, etc. But I didn't give up, and gradually a small amount of energy appeared around, joining the community centre, turning that from a dead space to a vibrant space. And from that, somebody else said they wanted to take a bit of derelict land and turn that into a city farm, which is now Oxford City Farm. And from that, the closed children's centre, we were asked to get involved in that. And that's now Flows, the place in the park, which is now very famous in Oxford as a community hub run by the community itself. Breaking boundaries, breaking the mold, etc. So now, and then, funnily enough, one of the signs that something was working well was that the local estate agent asked if they could sponsor the community centre, which we said no to. It's not about bringing money in, particularly in that way, but we got them involved in other ways through our window walkabout and some other community events. So yeah, it's been a real joy of the magic that can happen, and having worked in community development before in other people's communities, now I know why it doesn't work when you do it that direction, but it works in your own community if you do it grassroots up, and that's where the magic has happened. We see it, every day. People come to Florence Park and say, "How come this place is so friendly?" And it took a good few years, and it's not been all easy by any stretch, but we just keep on keeping an open mind, keep on zooming out, keep on trying to work for the greater good, in terms of trying to involve as many people as possible in being part of a vibrant community.
That's great, Jane.
That's a really great story, Jane, and thanks very much indeed for sharing it with us. I remember when I first moved to Glasgow, one of the first things I noticed that people talk to each other at bus stops, and like you, I came back to London and started doing that, and got treated as a danger rather than a friendly face. But well done on your perseverance. Can I also suggest, Mark Howard? You put a very interesting. I'm just dealing with my cat here, and my cat's called Cleo, and we recently rescued her, and I find her completely irresistible. So, um, Mark, you put something very interesting in the chat about the role of employers in investing in the communities from which they draw a workforce. Could you elaborate a little on that point, which sounds like a very important one to me?
Hi. Um, Roasted by my own petard, isn't
Yeah,
it?
there you
The work I do and what I've got involved in is over the years has been predominantly, as you know, Brandon, we've spoken many, many times, in the private sector, and I've always been astounded at, especially nowadays, the money that is being spent by employers on health and well-being. And actually, when you look at it, I call it a beautiful mess, the world of health and well-being. There's a lot of sort of stuff out there, strange stuff, good stuff, bad stuff. It's never linked up together, but they spend millions and well, zillions of pounds. And the workplace isn't usually, certainly not 50% of the cause of people's ill health. There's other determinants, wider determinants, which if I'm speaking to you, I'm sorry if I'm teaching you guys the obvious, but and I often think to myself, why don't, and I speak to employers, why don't you spend the amount of money, if you're spending £1, £2 million on an EAP scheme, an employee assistance program um, to support people who have mental ill health, why don't you spend it perhaps on their communities and where they're coming from, where they're living in a different way, and you'll have a much wider and broader impact on health in the community. You'll get far more respect for your company, and it's just that sort of, if you like, that social democratic approach rather than an out and out capitalistic approach, because most of them are paying for those services hugely more than they would pay for the services if they bought them directly from the community, say on a social prescribing basis. So I know I don't sound it, I come from Hull, and I've seen people buying physiotherapy services and support services in Hull for 80, £90 when it costs 30. And the reason that difference is because people in the middle are taking the margins and selling it. So that's all I'm saying. If we want to improve our communities, perhaps you need to involve in some way more than they currently are with their various schemes, community schemes, and far more a harder way, if you'd like. That's maybe a wrong word. than we currently do. That's my provocation, as I say.
Good. It's good. But,
Thanks, Mark.
and again, what's interesting, Mark, about that is that what we're doing in that conversation, just so people are following it as well, because you can translate this principle in many different ways, is we're changing the unit of change. So instead of thinking the unit of change is contained within the business or within the staff complement or within whatever the management decides, we're actually thinking about the business within the context of the neighborhood. So the neighborhood becomes a primary unit of health, a primary
Yes.
unit of trade, a primary. And when you think about it that way, it really opens up a lot of prospects for well-being, for economic possibilities, but also, I think, like you say, for the potential of what I would see as some real prospects around how staff themselves connect with local places, not just in terms of what they buy, but also how they move through places. I was in Perth just over the summer in Australia, and I spent one of the days that I was there on a street called Flower Street many years ago. It's where a lot of the traders would sell flowers from across the city, but they were actually competing with each other. And again, one of the things the community builder took care to do was not just to build through community development, the connections with the not-for-profits and the local residents, but also to help the businesses connect. They were really disconnected, not just from the neighborhood, but from other businesses as well. And that connection has massively transformed the well-being of everybody that's involved and their attitude. So I think you're really onto something there.
I
Thanks
think
very
I
much.
think the wider piece is, that our basic framework, our construct have changed, obviously since the the lockdown, etc., and COVID. But things have changed so much, yet we're not changing how we deliver to those changed circumstances.
Yeah. Just really quickly, because I know Chris wants to come in, Brenda, but I just put in a recent paper that I co-authored for the Lancet on reimagining how we think about social prescribing, and given that Mark referenced social prescribing, and obviously I co-authored it, so I have a view, but I would suggest that social prescribing really needs to get more serious about taking a community perspective rather than an individualized or pathological perspective. I think there's a lot that's commendable about it, but I think there's a lot more potential if we think about it through the lens that Mark is describing, and more broadly then into the community. So for what it's worth, I've just put a link in there.
Thanks, and of course we'll share all of the chat, including any links in there, and by all means, anybody else, add them if you think they're interesting with everybody afterwards. For now, over to Chris Edmund. Welcome, Chris. And what would you like to say?
Thanks, Brendan and Cormac. So I'm based in Jersey, as you know, island of 100,000 people, where it should be possible to do a lot of this work well. I was inspired by Cormac's book 5 or 6 years ago to get much more involved in community building. I'm a physician by background who works with businesses, actually, Mark, so I'm providing part of that sort of mixed service. But my focus is very much on how do we work, how do we integrate things, how do we stop thinking in terms of services, how do we collaborate, how do we work with communities as one. And even in an island of 100,000 people, it's been extremely difficult to make progress because of governments and businesses thinking in terms of services, and services with KPIs and metrics and individual outcomes. And there's been an interesting media thing in the island in the last week. Our local sort of disability workplace support charity had a large amount of funding pulled from government this year, and there was community uproar, and the funding's been replaced, actually, which is a good outcome in one way. But I think it highlighted a lot. The issue came from the charity not wanting to share individual level data on every person they were working with the government, and the government wanted that for their funding. They wouldn't think of it in terms of neighborhood and community and developing system-wide change. The commissioners want individual level data, and I find this with my business clients as well. They want defined services with defined KPIs. And what we're trying to do in the world that you envisage, Cormac, is one that's far subtler than that and far more complex and far harder to for the people with the money to understand. And as I said, I've been working on this 5 or 6 years and hitting the same barrier over and over about that understanding. Another example, our diabetes prevention program's just been given to a UK provider to deliver remotely because they were cheaper. They can't understand our local community. They're not here. Um, and how do you have any examples where you've come up against these barriers regularly and been able to genuinely rekindle democracy in that central way and change that power dynamic where the people that currently have the power seem so desperate to hold on to it?
Hmm. I mean, you're right to say that islands should, on paper, be the perfect scale at which this can be possible. You know, it's like the Isle of Man, where I've done a lot of work, 26 different parish councils. You'd imagine, my goodness, there's a perfect scale at which we could potentially do things. But as we know, the complexities start to, even in very hyper local and smaller parish councils, as we know, there can be complexities around decision making. So thinking about, like, what have we learned from the Isle of Man, the Isle of Wight, Shetland, some of the work that you and I have shared, Chris, and then outside of the UK context in other island communities and Norway and different parts of the world that I've worked in. And remember, interestingly, Singapore is also an island, and actually in scale, it's smaller than some of the islands, but it has 5 million people. So, but the small population piece and the government, I think one of the difficulties is that regardless of the scale on paper, it's pretty much following a template of how governments function in relation to people, which is very much post Second World War and probably post 71, actually. After Nixon basically did a number on the gold reserve and started trying to make big long story about it. But I tried to write it in the book. But essentially, what started to happen was governments started aping a lot of how both militaristic organizations and commercial organizations function. The view was we'd be taken much more seriously. And by the 80s, with Reaganism and Thatcherism, this idea that your government needs to look like a commercial entity, it has to have the same exoskeleton, really was a fundamental error. By about the mid 80s, when Madonna was singing, I'm a material girl in a material world, the consequence of that was we were pulling an awful lot of our local staff out of these neighborhoods and we were syndicalizing them into professionals. So they were beginning to identify not with the neighbors they serve, but with the uniformed professionals that they serve with. So, in all kinds of ways, the edifice by which we would naturally, relationally relate at neighborhood level was being slowly ripped down. We didn't even realize we were doing it. And I think as a consequence, people would really find it very, very hard to, when they listen to us speak sometimes, to understand, what's the difference between a military organization and well-being organization. If you're using terms as a hospital, like dispatching patients or whatever it might be, it's not the right language. But the language betrays something around the values and the traditions and the way we function, which is dehumanizing and disconnecting. So, in a sense, the system's perfectly set up now to produce antibodies to kill off anything that is going to move in the direction you'd like it to move in. So we have to trick the system. So one way of doing that is to convince parts of the system not to actually do it themselves, but to find people like Jane who are much more localized and give them enough cover So we talked about this before, but there are people in the system and, they're good at minding the gap between the red tape you're describing and the potential that communities, obviously have, as Jane has already revealed to us and others. So in some way, we need to build up that mind the gap function, the gappers who have the ability to create almost an exclusion zone to allow people like you and people like Mark to play in the gap and be exploitative, to prospect around the edges as we kind of pan for community gold. But without that, what ends up happening is the institution will inevitably overreach and it will reach beyond its own grasp, which means it will disappoint the people that it's supposed to be serving, burn out the people who are serving, and ultimately open up space for a lot of what we're seeing today, which is a rise of huge discontentment and polarization. And everybody else, all the innovators then go over and start talking about really fun things like, how can we all just reform or reimagine our institutions? But essentially, they're just navel gazing. It won't make any difference unless we create the structural space. So my sense of it is that you take, and just briefly finish on this, but you take, say, an island I know reasonably well, the Isle of Man, which has the distinction of having the longest sitting uninterrupted government, set for 1,000 years, not interrupted by war. So you think they'd have figured it out, wouldn't you? But but it was interrupted. That's the point. It was colonized by other cultures, which are cultures that are about, privatizing wealth and socializing, ill health and a lot of the challenges that society are carrying. So I think really understanding what local government and public good institutions are about is important as well, and then giving them the cover and the freedom to do that. I'm really interested in that, Chris, and linking a little bit with you and Mark. I'd be very interested in a conversation about what does it mean to be a civic professional and to work to ensure that your institution's assets are aligned to foreground the assets of community rather than foregrounding your own ego or your own mission. So this idea that a public good institution is an institution that foregrounds community and backgrounds the institution is a really central idea in the book. And it's one that is very, very hard to do, but it's a lot of fun to figure out.
Thanks, Cormac. And we've got time possibly for two, but certainly for one last input from Sandra Beaton. Sandra, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much. I just wanted to ask Cormac how he feels about the tension between large-scale institutions extracting good from the community, whereas what he's advocating is community providing the good themselves. Fundamental to the question is that we live and work in this extractive world where business and institutions are extracting the living daylights out of communities and putting very little back into those communities. So we have, in the case of the neighborhoods inquiry, we have 1,000 neighborhoods that they've identified that are absolute pits in terms of progression in terms of services. So, but the problem is that a huge amount of what goes on around those communities that are so much in need is that they have success built on those disenfranchised neighborhoods. Sorry, I'm not making myself very clear, but yes, the world is extractive and it consistently extracts from the most needy communities who cannot pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and it continues and continues.
I think you're right in the main that extractive behavior has become increasingly the norm. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to open up space for people who often are the victims of that colonization, the victims of that imposition, not alone to stop that happening, but also to move towards a preferred future. So I think one of the ways to begin to think about this question is pretty much the theme of today's conversation, is not just about the neighborhood in isolation, but the neighborhood in connection with other neighborhoods and in connection with people that should be functioning as allies, like local government. I think there's only one thing worse than an extractive large entity doing a neighborhood over. And that's an extractive large entity being enabled by a local government that should be blocking that being done over. So, yes, you're right in what you're saying, but by goodness, the starting point is let's not make it easy for them. And in all kinds of ways, I have seen third sector organizations, very large third sector organizations, sell out their core values for contracts and become bigger and more bloated. And, public organizations that are meant to serve the public good, at least if we're starting there and we're getting that right, I think we can actually then begin to build domes of protection. What we're seeing internationally now, as we see the breakdown or the potential breakdown of world order, is that it's really important not alone that we respect the sovereignty of states, but also the sovereignty of neighborhoods, but also we find ways to collaborate. We started with a Fisher story. I mean, anybody who knows anything about fishing knows that it's both local and it's global. Fish, for example, the movement of salmon. It's fascinating to look at the year in the life of a salmon. It doesn't just stay in one place. It's not just an amqui, you know. So beginning to think about what are the different kinds of interdependent relationships we have. Extractive behavior is very much, I think, explained by this idea that we are not our brothers, sisters, planets keepers. And actually we are. We are interdependent, not independent. So somehow the paradox that we're talking about in Rekindling Democracy is we need to find a way to honor and respect the hyperlocal, but we also need to find a way to nurture and cultivate mass localism across the planet. It's not either or, it's both and then some. And I think our starting point, our allies like we have here in this conversation, local neighbors, often we don't organize at the neighborhood level, and institutions that are prepared to come around that. I'd love to see more institutions being community oriented and not singularly focused on programs or services. We can have both, but it would be nice if we could foreground that conversation. I think that would open up a space for us to begin to think about how can we not alone mutualize what we care about, but also mutualize our power. So when bad actors do oppress, we can give them a run for their money. And look, we have loads of examples of where communities have done just that. I think of the cod fishery industry in the 60s and how that was damaged in so many ways. Communities pushed back against that. So we have stories where communities have organized, not alone at neighborhood level, but across neighborhoods to really make change happen. And those are the stories I've tried to convey in Rekindling Democracy, because I think stories matter. They're the fuel for an awful lot of the kind of social movements I'm sure people on this call are part of. So I agree with you, Sandra. I think we have to proceed with our hazard lights on. There's a lot of bad actors out there, but I would just like to finish by saying I think there's a lot of good actors closer to home than we might realize. And so the starting point is to make friends with your neighbors before you need them.
Thank you.
What a great place to stop at. Sandra, thanks for that great question as the last question we got time for. And thanks, Cormac, for that answer. We've hardly scratched the surface. We've not been able to pick up on some of the great contributions in the chat from Colin Talbot, from Derek Harper, from John Wade, and others. Sorry if I don't mention, but I do urge you to look at those. But we have to draw it to a close. I want to close by thanking you all for coming, to let you know that we'll publicize the next sessions in this series as soon as we can. And to close by saying to Cormac in particular, thank you very much for joining us and giving us the benefits of your insights. I cannot recommend Cormac's book too highly. If you haven't read it, you'll find it's something you can dip into time and again. So I really recommend it to you. And with that, I'm going to close again. Thanks to all and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you all. Take care. Thanks, Brendan.